She stood in his doorway, wearing blood-stained buckskin and carrying the weight of watching her entire village burn to ash. Elijah Cole had no way of knowing that the woman he was about to save would become both his wife and the reason powerful men now wanted him dead. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Elijah Cole never expected to find salvation standing in his doorway. At 53, he had made peace with solitude, his weathered hands knowing nothing but the cracked leather of reins and the rough grain of fence posts. The Wyoming Territory had taken everything from him. His wife to fever 15 years past, his daughter to a marriage that carried her east, and his hope to the endless winters that seemed to grow colder with each passing year. Then she appeared on his threshold like a vision from another world, her dark braids falling over buckskin adorned with beadwork that told stories he couldn't read, her eyes holding secrets deeper than any canyon he had ever crossed. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from today, and if this story moves you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I have something truly special waiting for you. The October wind cut across the high plains of Bitter Creek Valley, carrying with it the first promise of snow that would soon blanket the land in white silence. Elijah stood on his porch, the iron hook he used for moving hay bales still gripped in his calloused hand, staring at the young woman who had materialized from the gathering dusk like a ghost made flesh. She couldn't have been more than 25, her copper skin glowing in the dying light, her posture straight and proud despite the exhaustion he could see in the set of her shoulders. Behind her, the prairie stretched endlessly toward the mountains that had watched over this land since before memory began. She spoke first, her voice carrying the melodic cadence of someone for whom English was a learned language rather than a birthright. The soldiers burned our village 3 days past. My family is gone. I walked until I found a place where the smoke could not follow. Elijah felt the words hit him like physical blows. He had heard rumors in town about the cavalry's movements, about the government's renewed efforts to relocate the remaining tribes to reservations further north. He had kept his opinions to himself, as he kept most things, but the reality of that violence standing before him in the form of this young woman made his stomach turn with shame for his own kind. "You're Lakota," he said, not a question but a recognition. His late wife, Margaret, had taught him to identify the different nations by their dress, their beadwork patterns, their languages. She had possessed a respect for the native peoples that most white settlers lacked, a respect she had tried to instill in him during their 2 brief years together. The young woman nodded, her dark eyes studying him with an intensity that made him feel like she was reading the contents of his soul. "I am called Winona. It means firstborn daughter in your tongue. Though now I am the last daughter, the only one who remains." The grief in her voice was controlled but unmistakable, the kind of sorrow that had been pressed down deep because there was no time or safety for proper mourning. Elijah set down the iron hook, suddenly conscious of how it might appear threatening in his grip. "Come inside," he said gruffly, the words feeling strange in a mouth that had grown accustomed to speaking only to horses and cattle. "You'll freeze out here when the sun goes down." She hesitated, and he understood the calculation happening behind her eyes. What was more dangerous, the cold that would kill her slowly, or the white man who might kill her quickly? He had no way to prove his intentions except through action, so he simply turned and walked into the cabin, leaving the door open behind him. After a long moment, he heard her soft footsteps following. The interior of his home was sparse but clean, the habits of a military man never quite leaving him even 2 decades after he had hung up his uniform. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across walls lined with shelves of books, the only luxury he allowed himself in this hard land. Winona's eyes moved across the room, taking in every detail with the sharp awareness of someone who had learned that survival depended on knowing your surroundings. "You live alone," she observed. It was not a question. "My wife passed 15 years ago," Elijah replied, moving to the cast iron stove where a pot of venison stew had been simmering. "My daughter grew up and married a man from Pennsylvania. She writes letters sometimes when she remembers she has a father." He ladled stew into a bowl and set it on the rough wooden table, gesturing for Winona to sit. She approached cautiously, like a wild creature being offered food from a human hand, unsure whether the gift came with a trap attached. But hunger won over caution, and she settled onto the bench across from him, her hands wrapping around the bowl to absorb its warmth before she lifted the spoon to her lips. Elijah sat across from her, not eating, simply watching as color slowly returned to her face with each mouthful of hot food. The firelight caught the intricate patterns of her dress, geometric shapes in red, blue, and yellow that seemed to pulse with meaning he couldn't decipher. "Why did you open your door to me?" Winona asked when the bowl was empty. Her directness surprised him, though he supposed a woman who had survived what she had survived had no patience for the careful dances of polite society. "Most of your people would have turned me away, or worse." Elijah considered the question, turning it over in his mind like a stone whose weight he was trying to gauge. "Because my wife would have haunted me until my dying day if I'd left any creature to freeze on my doorstep, and because I've seen enough killing in my life to know that it solves nothing and costs everything." He paused, his gray eyes meeting her dark ones across the table. "I was a soldier once, in the war between the states. I've got blood on my hands that will never wash clean. I won't add more if I can help it." Something shifted in Winona's expression. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the first tentative acknowledgement that trust might someday be possible. Outside, the wind howled its mournful song across the prairie, and the first flakes of snow began to fall, white and silent and utterly indifferent to the fragile human drama unfolding in the small cabin on the edge of nowhere. The night stretched before them, full of questions neither yet knew how to ask. The first week passed in a careful dance of boundaries and small kindnesses. Elijah gave Winona the bedroom that had once belonged to his daughter, a small space with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the eastern hills where the sun rose each morning in brilliant displays of orange and gold. He took to sleeping in the main room on a bedroll near the fire, insisting it was no hardship for a man who had spent years sleeping on worse during the war. Winona accepted the arrangement without argument, though he caught her watching him sometimes with an expression he couldn't quite read, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces refused to fit together in any pattern she recognized. She was not idle during those early days. Despite his protests that she was a guest and under no obligation, Winona began to make herself useful in ways that transformed the bachelor efficiency of his home into something warmer and more alive. She mended shirts he had been meaning to repair for months. She organized his kitchen stores with a logic that actually made sense. She even managed to coax his ancient milk cow into producing more than she had in years, using techniques and gentle words in her own language that the animal seemed to understand better than any English commands Elijah had ever issued. The cabin began to smell different, not just of wood smoke and coffee, but of the herbs she dried by the window and the bread she learned to bake from the cookbook his wife had left behind. The townspeople of Bitter Creek noticed, of course. In a settlement of fewer than 200 souls, nothing escaped observation or comment. Elijah felt their eyes on him when he rode in for supplies, heard the whispers that stopped abruptly when he entered the general store. Harlan Briggs, who ran the mercantile with his pinch-faced wife, was the first to address the matter directly. "Heard you've got yourself a squaw up at your place," Briggs said, the word dropping from his lips like something rotten. "The territory's got laws about that sort of thing, Cole. Might want to think about what you're doing before the wrong people start asking questions." Elijah felt his jaw tighten, the old soldier's anger rising in his chest like a tide. "She's a human being who needed shelter," he replied, his voice flat and hard. "Last I checked, Christian charity wasn't against any law, and what happens on my land is my business, not yours or anyone else's." He gathered his purchases and left without another word, but the encounter stayed with him during the long ride home, settling into his bones alongside the cold wind. He knew Briggs wouldn't let the matter rest. Men like him never did. They needed someone to look down upon, someone to blame for their own failures and frustrations, and a native woman living with a white rancher was too perfect a target to ignore. When he told Winona about the conversation that evening, she received the news with the calm resignation of someone who had expected nothing different. "Your people have never wanted mine here," she said. her hands continuing their steady work of beating a new pair of moccasins to replace the ones worn through during her flight. They call us savages while they burn our homes and kill our children. They speak of God's love while they steal the land He gave us. I learned long ago not to expect fairness from those who see us as less than human." Her words carried no bitterness, only a weary acceptance that cut Elijah deeper than anger would have. "Not all of us are like that," he said quietly, knowing even as he spoke how inadequate the words were. "My wife Margaret, she believed your people had much to teach us if we would only listen. She used to say the land belonged to no one, that we were all just borrowing it for our brief time walking upon it." Winona looked up from her beadwork, and for the first time since her arrival, he saw something like curiosity in her dark eyes. "Your wife sounds like she was an unusual woman." She was, Elijah agreed, the familiar ache of loss stirring in his chest. She saw the world differently than most, saw people differently. She would have liked you, I think. And she would have been ashamed of how we've treated your nation. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence that followed his words. Outside, a coyote called across the frozen prairie, its lonely song echoing off the hills. Winona set down her beadwork and folded her hands in her lap, her expression thoughtful. "Among my people," she said slowly, "when a man gives shelter to a woman who is not his kin, it creates an obligation, a bond that must be honored or released. I have stayed in your home for 7 suns now. If I remain much longer, there will be those who assume that bond has become something more permanent." Elijah understood what she was saying, the cultural implications that differed from his own people's assumptions, but led to similar conclusions. "What would you have me do?" he asked. "I won't turn you out into the cold, and I won't pretend I haven't noticed how much better my life has become since you arrived." Winona studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something, truth perhaps, or the hidden cruelty she had learned to expect from white men. "I do not know yet," she admitted finally. "My heart is still heavy with grief for my family. My spirit is still lost between the world that was and whatever world is coming. But I know that I cannot stay in this between place forever. The winter will demand a decision from both of us." Elijah nodded slowly, accepting her words and the weight they carried. "Then we'll face that decision together," he said, "when the time comes. Until then, you have a home here for as long as you need one." The trouble began 3 weeks after Winona's arrival, when the first heavy snows had locked the valley in white silence and travel between homesteads became a matter of necessity rather than choice. Elijah had ridden into town for supplies that couldn't wait until spring, medicine for a cough that had settled in Winona's chest, ammunition for the wolves that had been circling closer to his cattle, and salt for preserving the deer he had managed to bring down before the worst of the weather hit. He left Winona at the cabin with strict instructions to bar the door and speak to no one, a precaution that felt increasingly necessary as the whispers in town grew louder and more poisonous with each passing week. He should have known something was wrong when the streets of Bitter Creek seemed emptier than usual, when the few faces he passed wore expressions of anticipation mixed with something that looked uncomfortably like excitement. Harlan Briggs stood on the porch of his mercantile with 3 other men, their breath fogging in the cold air as they watched Elijah tie his horse to the rail. One of them was Thomas Greenwood, who owned the ranch adjacent to Elijah's property and had been trying to buy his land for years. Another was a stranger, a tall man with a military bearing and the cold eyes of someone who had long ago stopped seeing other human beings as anything more than obstacles or opportunities. "Elijah Cole," Greenwood called out, his voice carrying across the frozen street. "We've been waiting for you. The territorial marshal here has some questions about your house guest." Elijah felt his stomach drop, but he kept his face carefully neutral as he approached the group. His years as a soldier had taught him that showing fear to men like these only encouraged them, like blood in the water drawing sharks. "Marshal," he nodded to the stranger, "what can I do for you?" The marshal stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip in a gesture that was clearly meant to intimidate. "Name's Crawford. I've received reports that you're harboring a fugitive on your property, a Lakota woman who fled the reservation at Standing Rock." "She's not from Standing Rock," Elijah replied evenly. "Her village was burned by cavalry 3 weeks ago, She came to my door half frozen and starving, and I gave her shelter. That's not harboring a fugitive. That's basic human decency." Crawford's thin lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "The Indian Appropriations Act says otherwise. Any native found off reservation land without proper documentation is subject to immediate removal and detention. You're obstructing federal authority by keeping her hidden." Elijah felt the old anger rising again, the fury that had never quite left him since the war, since he had seen what men were capable of doing to each other in the name of causes they barely understood. "She's not hidden. She's in my home, recovering from nearly dying of exposure, and I won't hand her over to be marched back to some camp where she'll likely die anyway." The temperature seemed to drop several degrees as the men on the porch exchanged glances. Greenwood stepped forward, his expression falsely sympathetic. "Now, Elijah, be reasonable. We're all neighbors here. Nobody wants trouble. But you have to understand how this looks. A man your age, living alone with a young Indian woman. People are talking." The implication hung in the air like poison, and Elijah understood suddenly that this wasn't really about federal law or reservation policy. This was about land, his land. The water rights that Greenwood had coveted for years. The prime grazing territory that would make Greenwood the largest rancher in 3 counties if he could only get Elijah out of the way. The Indian woman was just an excuse, a convenient lever to pry him loose from everything he had built. "What people say is their own affair," Elijah replied, his voice hard as the frozen ground beneath their feet. "But I'll tell you what's going to happen. I'm going to buy my supplies, ride home to my property, and continue living my life as I see fit. If the marshal here wants to ride out and try to take that woman from my home, he's welcome to try. But I was a sharpshooter in the Union Army, and I haven't forgotten how to defend what's mine." The words fell into silence like stones into deep water. Crawford's hand tightened on his revolver, and for a moment Elijah thought the man might actually draw. But something in Elijah's eyes must have given him pause. The steady certainty of a man who had faced death too many times to fear it anymore, who had nothing left to lose except the small spark of purpose that had rekindled in his chest since a young Lakota woman had appeared on his doorstep. "This isn't over," Crawford said finally. "I'll be filing a report with the territorial governor. You might find your neighbors less friendly when federal troops come calling." He turned and stalked away toward the saloon, and after a moment Greenwood and the others followed, leaving Elijah alone in the bitter cold. He stood there for a long moment, his breath clouding in the air, feeling the weight of what had just happened settling onto his shoulders. He had made enemies today, powerful enemies with the law on their side and greed in their hearts. The fragile piece of his solitary existence had been shattered, and there would be no putting those pieces back together. When he finally gathered his supplies and rode home through the gathering darkness, he found Winona waiting by the window, her face illuminated by lamplight, her eyes full of questions he didn't know how to answer. He told her everything: the marshal, the threats, the hunger he had seen in Greenwood's eyes. She listened without interruption, her expression growing more grave with each word. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as if searching for answers in its dancing flames. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should leave. My presence here will only bring you more trouble." Elijah shook his head, surprising himself with the vehemence of his response. "You're not going anywhere. Whatever comes, we face it together." The weeks that followed were filled with a tension that hung over the cabin like storm clouds refusing to break. Elijah found himself sleeping lighter than he had in years, his old army rifle within arm's reach, his ears tuned to every sound that rose above the constant moan of winter wind. Winona noticed the change in him. How could she not? But she said nothing, only redoubled her efforts to make herself useful, as if proving her worth might somehow protect them both from the forces gathering beyond their door. They fell into a rhythm that felt almost like partnership, almost like the beginning of something neither of them had names for yet. He taught her to read from the books that lined his walls, discovering in her a quick mind hungry for knowledge that her disrupted life had denied her. She taught him words in Lakota, sharing stories of her people that painted pictures of a world he had never known existed. A world of spirits living in rivers and mountains, of buffalo herds that had once darkened the plains from horizon to horizon, of a way of life that his own people were systematically erasing from the earth. One evening, as snow fell soft and silent outside the frosted windows, Winona asked him about the war. He had avoided the subject until then, deflecting her questions with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 2 decades trying to forget. But something in her eyes that night, a genuine desire to understand him, perhaps, or simply the intimacy that had grown between them through long hours of shared solitude, broke through his defenses. "I was 19 when I enlisted," he began, his voice rough with memories he rarely allowed to surface. "Thought I was going to save the Union, free the slaves, come home a hero. Didn't understand what war really meant until I saw my first battle. Men I'd eaten breakfast with that morning, lying in pieces across a field in Virginia. Boys younger than me, crying for their mothers as they bled out in the mud." He paused, staring into the fire with eyes that saw things far distant from this small cabin on the frozen prairie. "I killed 37 men that I know of, probably more. Some of them were shooting at me. Others were just in the wrong place when I pulled the trigger. The Army gave me medals, called me a hero. But heroes don't wake up screaming 20 years later, still seeing the faces of men they killed." Winona listened in silence, her expression holding no judgment, only a deep understanding that came from her own intimate acquaintance with loss and violence. "Among my people," she said when he had finished, "warriors who have taken lives must go through a cleansing ceremony. The elders say that killing, even when necessary, leaves marks on the spirit that must be acknowledged and healed. Without that healing, the marks fester like wounds that never close." Elijah looked at her, this young woman who had lost everything and still somehow retained a wisdom that put his own hard-won understanding to shame. "Maybe that's what's been wrong with me all these years," he said quietly. "Never had anyone to help me heal those wounds. Just buried them deep and hoped they'd stay buried." "They never do," Winona replied, "but acknowledging them is the first step. You carry your guilt like a stone around your neck. Perhaps it is time to set that stone down." The conversation shifted something between them, opened a door that had been locked for so long Elijah had forgotten it existed. In the days that followed, he found himself talking more than he had in years, about Margaret, about his daughter Sarah, about the dreams he had once held for a life that had somehow slipped through his fingers like water. Winona shared her own stories in return, speaking of her mother who had been a healer, her father who had been a hunter of great skill, her younger brothers who had been learning the old ways when the soldiers came. The grief was still fresh, still raw, but in the sharing of it, something began to ease for both of them. Two wounded souls finding in each other a mirror that reflected not their pain, but their capacity to survive it. It was during this time of growing closeness that Winona first spoke of the old ways of her people regarding marriage. Among the Lakota, she explained one evening as they sat together mending harnesses by lamplight, marriage is not just a bond between two people. It is a joining of families, of communities, of purposes. When a man wishes to take a wife, he must prove himself worthy through deeds, through gifts, through the respect he shows to her and her kin. The woman, too, must choose. She is not property to be traded, but a partner to be earned. Elijah listened carefully, hearing beneath her words a question she wasn't quite asking. "And if a woman has no family left," he asked, "if there is no one to receive gifts or judge worthiness?" "Then the spirits of her ancestors watch in their place," Winona replied, her dark eyes meeting his across the lamplight. "And the woman must trust her own heart to guide her toward a man who will honor the memory of those she has lost." The silence that followed was heavy with implication, with possibility, with the weight of decisions not yet made but slowly taking shape in the space between them. Outside, the wind had died to a whisper, and the snow had stopped falling, leaving the world wrapped in white silence. Elijah set down the harness he had been working on and leaned forward, his weathered face serious in the flickering light. "Winona," he said carefully, choosing each word like a man picking his way across uncertain ground. "I know I'm old. I know my people have done terrible things to yours. I know I have nothing to offer except a hard life on a piece of land that powerful men want to take from me. But if you would consider staying, not as a guest, but as something more permanent. I would spend whatever years I have left trying to be worthy of that trust. She did not answer immediately, and he did not expect her to. Some decisions required time, required the counsel of spirits and ancestors he could not see. But when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, and her eyes held something that looked almost like hope. "I will consider your words, Elijah Cole, and when the winter breaks, I will give you my answer." The answer came sooner than either of them expected, forced by circumstances neither could have foreseen. It was a Tuesday morning in late January when the sound of approaching horses shattered the quiet rhythm of their days. Elijah was in the barn tending to his cattle when Winona's voice cut through the cold air, sharp with warning. Riders coming, many of them. He grabbed his rifle and moved quickly to the cabin, positioning himself at the window where he could see the trail that wound down from the northern ridge. His heart sank as he counted the figures emerging from the tree line, 8 men on horseback, led by the unmistakable form of Marshal Crawford. Beside him rode Thomas Greenwood, and behind them came 6 others whose faces Elijah recognized from town, men who had always been willing to do dirty work for the right price. "Get in the back room," Elijah told Winona, his voice calm despite the fear coiling in his gut. "There's a loose board in the floor near the bed. If things go bad, lift it and follow the crawl space to the root cellar. There's a door there that opens behind the woodpile." She didn't argue, didn't waste precious seconds with questions or protests. Instead, she placed her hand briefly on his arm, a touch that conveyed more than words could have, and disappeared into the shadows of the back room. Elijah took a deep breath, checked his rifle, and opened the front door to face whatever was coming. The riders stopped 50 yards from the cabin, spreading out in a formation that spoke of military training or at least familiarity with violence. Crawford dismounted and walked forward alone, his hands visible, but his posture radiating the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Cole," he called out, "I've got a warrant here for the arrest of the Indian woman you've been harboring. You can hand her over peacefully, or we can do this the hard way. Either way, she's coming with us." Elijah stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. "You and I both know that warrant isn't worth the paper it's written on. This is about Greenwood wanting my land, not about any federal law." Crawford shrugged, a smile playing at the corners of his thin lips. "Maybe so, but the result's the same. You're 1 man against 8, and we've got legal authority on our side. Even if you manage to take a few of us down, you can't stop all of us. And when it's over, we'll have the woman anyway, and you'll be dead or in prison for resisting federal officers." The mathematics were undeniable, and Elijah felt the weight of his years pressing down on him like never before. He was 53, his reflexes slower than they had been, his body carrying the accumulated damage of a lifetime of hard work and harder fighting. He might take 3 of them, maybe 4 if luck was with him, but that would still leave others to do as they pleased with Winona, with his home, with everything he had spent his life building. "Then let's talk," he said, lowering his rifle slightly. "What does Greenwood actually want?" The rancher himself pushed forward on his horse, his face split by a grin that made Elijah's skin crawl. "Now you're being sensible. Here's my offer. Sign over the deed to your property, take whatever you can carry, and leave the territory. In exchange, I'll convince the marshal here to forget about the Indian woman. She can go wherever she wants, as long as it's far from here." It was a lie, of course. Elijah could see it in the way Greenwood's eyes flickered toward the cabin, hungry and calculating. The moment Elijah signed anything, they would kill him and take Winona anyway. There would be no witnesses to contradict whatever story they chose to tell. But the offer bought time, and time was the only currency he had left. "Let me think about it," he said. "Give me until tomorrow morning." Crawford laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the frozen hills. "You're in no position to negotiate." But Greenwood held up a hand, silencing the marshal. "Let him have his night. A man should have time to say goodbye to everything he's built before he loses it. We'll be back at dawn, Cole. Have your answer ready, and have the woman where we can see her." The riders turned and headed back toward town, their dark figures growing smaller against the white expanse of snow until they finally disappeared over the ridge. Elijah stood on the porch long after they had gone, his mind racing through possibilities and finding each one leading to the same dead end. When he finally went inside, Winona was waiting for him by the fire, her face pale but her eyes steady. "I heard everything," she said. "You should give them what they want. Your life is worth more than this land." "My life isn't worth anything without something to live for," Elijah replied, setting his rifle against the wall. "And I'm not going to hand you over to men who see you as less than human." He moved to stand before her, this young woman who had come into his life like an unexpected gift and somehow become the center of everything that mattered. "There's another way," he said slowly. "One they won't expect." Winona looked at him with questions in her eyes, and he continued before his courage could fail. "If we were married, legally married in a way even territorial law has to recognize, you'd have the rights of a white woman's wife. They couldn't take you without taking me, couldn't charge you with being off reservation land because you'd be living on your husband's property with his full consent and protection." It was a desperate gamble, full of holes that any competent lawyer could drive a wagon through, but it was the only card he had left to play. Winona was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You would do this? Bind yourself to me forever, just to protect me from those men?" "Not just to protect you," Elijah said, his voice rough with emotion he had kept buried for too long. "Because somewhere in these past weeks, protecting you stopped being a duty and started being the only thing I want to do with whatever time I have left. Because I love you, Winona, and if that's not enough reason for you, then I'll understand. But I had to tell you before tomorrow comes." The firelight danced across Winona's face as she absorbed his words, her dark eyes reflecting flames that seemed to mirror something kindling within her own heart. For a long moment she said nothing, and Elijah felt each second stretch into eternity, his confession hanging between them like smoke that might dissipate or might take solid form depending on winds he could not control. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a tremor he had never heard before. Not fear, but something deeper, something that sounded almost like wonder. "Among my people," she said slowly, "love is not spoken of lightly. It is a sacred thing, a gift from the spirits that binds two souls across lifetimes. When I fled my burning village, I believed that part of my life was over. I believed I would carry my grief alone until the day I joined my ancestors in the spirit world." She stepped closer to him, close enough that he could smell the sage she used to wash her hair, close enough that he could see the pulse beating at the base of her throat. "But you opened your door to me when you had every reason to turn me away. You treated me as a person when your people see mine as animals. You shared your pain with me and allowed me to share mine with you." She reached up and placed her palm against his weathered cheek, her touch warm despite the cold that seeped through the cabin walls. "I did not come to your door looking for love, Elijah Cole, but I think perhaps love found me anyway." His hand came up to cover hers, this small brown hand that had known so much work and so much loss, and he felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed shut for 15 years. "Then you'll have me, even knowing what tomorrow might bring." Winona's lips curved into the first real smile he had seen from her, a smile that transformed her face from merely beautiful to radiant. "I will have you," she said. "Not because I need protection, though I do. Not because I have nowhere else to go, though that is also true. I will have you because my heart recognizes yours, because the spirits of my ancestors whisper that this is right, because when I imagine the days ahead, I cannot imagine them without you beside me." They stood together in the firelight, two people from worlds that should never have intersected, finding in each other something neither had expected to find again. When he bent to kiss her, it was gentle, almost reverent, the kiss of a man who understood the preciousness of what he was being given and was determined to honor it. The practical matters of the ceremony were arranged with desperate haste. Elijah rode through the darkness to the homestead of Jacob and Martha Whitfield, the only neighbors he trusted completely. Jacob had been a chaplain in the Union Army, still held credentials that allowed him to perform legal marriages, and his wife Martha had always treated the native peoples with the respect they deserved. When Elijah explained the situation, Jacob's face grew grave, But he did not hesitate. "Bring her here," he said. "We'll do it proper, with witnesses and documentation that even a territorial court will have to accept." Martha was already pulling out her wedding china, determined that this ceremony would have at least some of the dignity it deserved. They returned to the Whitfield homestead before midnight, Winona wrapped in a heavy blanket against the bitter cold, her eyes bright with a mixture of fear and hope that made Elijah's heart ache. Martha took her into the back room to help her prepare, emerging an hour later with Winona dressed in a simple white blouse and blue skirt that Martha had altered from her own wardrobe. Around Winona's neck hung the beaded necklace that had belonged to her mother, the only possession she had managed to save from her destroyed village. And in her hair, Martha had woven a crown of dried wildflowers preserved from the previous summer. She was beautiful, so beautiful that Elijah felt his breath catch in his throat and tears prick at eyes that had not wept since Margaret's funeral. The ceremony was brief but sincere. Jacob spoke words about love and commitment that transcended the boundaries of culture and race, that acknowledged the unusual circumstances while emphasizing the genuine bond between the two people standing before him. Winona spoke her vows in English and then repeated them in Lakota, her voice steady and sure. Elijah spoke his with the careful deliberation of a man making promises he fully intended to keep until his dying breath. When Jacob pronounced them husband and wife, the weight that had been pressing on Elijah's chest for weeks suddenly lifted, replaced by something that felt almost like peace. Whatever happened tomorrow, they would face it together. They would face it as family. Martha insisted they stay for a wedding supper, modest but warm, and pressed upon them a gift, a quilt she had made herself, stitched with patterns that she said represented the joining of two different lives into one shared journey. Winona accepted it with tears in her eyes, understanding the significance of the gesture from a white woman who owed her nothing but chose to give her kindness anyway. As they rode home through the frozen darkness, Winona leaned against Elijah's back, her arms wrapped around his waist, her head resting between his shoulder blades. The stars blazed overhead in the clear winter sky, and the snow-covered prairie stretched around them like a blank page waiting to be written upon. When they reached the cabin, Elijah carried his bride across the threshold, an old tradition that seemed to take on new meaning in this moment, this beginning of something unexpected and precious and fragile. They did not speak of what the morning would bring. Instead, they sat together by the fire, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, watching the flames dance and letting the silence speak for them. Some wedding nights were about passion, but theirs was about something quieter and perhaps more profound, the simple miracle of two people who had found each other against all odds, who had chosen each other when choosing meant risking everything. The fire burned low, the night deepened, and somewhere beyond the walls of their small sanctuary, the dawn was coming. But for now, they had this moment. For now, they had each other, and that would have to be enough. Dawn came too quickly, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed to mock the darkness of what the day would bring. Elijah woke with Winona still in his arms, her breathing soft and steady against his chest, her dark hair spread across the pillow like a river of silk. For a moment, he allowed himself to simply hold her, to memorize the weight of her against him, the warmth of her skin, the peace of her sleeping face. Then the sound of distant hoofbeats reached his ears, and the moment shattered like ice beneath a boot heel. "They're coming," he said quietly, and felt her instantly awaken, her body tensing with the alertness of someone who had learned that survival depended on responding quickly to danger. They dressed in silence, moving with the efficient coordination of two people who understood what was at stake. Winona pulled on the buckskin dress she had been wearing when she first arrived, its beaded patterns a declaration of identity she refused to hide. Elijah strapped on his gun belt and checked the chambers of both his revolver and the rifle, counting bullets and calculating odds that remained stubbornly against them. Before they stepped outside, he pulled from his pocket the marriage certificate Jacob Whitfield had prepared the night before, the ink still fresh, the signatures of two witnesses making it as legal as any document in the territory. "This stays with you," he told Winona, pressing the paper into her hands. Whatever happens, don't let them take it from you. It's your proof, your protection, your right to be here. She folded the certificate carefully and tucked it into the bodice of her dress, close to her heart. Then she reached up and kissed him, not gently this time, but fiercely, with all the passion and determination of a woman who had survived the destruction of everything she knew and refused to be destroyed herself. "I will stand beside you," she said when they parted, "not behind you, not hidden away, beside you, as your wife, as your partner, whatever comes." Elijah looked at her, this woman who had transformed his life in ways he was still struggling to comprehend, and felt something settle in his chest. Not peace exactly, but acceptance. If this was to be his last stand, at least he would not be making it alone. They walked out onto the porch together as the riders crested the ridge. There were more of them this time, 12 men instead of 8, some carrying torches despite the growing daylight, their intentions written clearly in their aggressive formation. Crawford led them as before, with Greenwood at his side, but there were others now whose faces Elijah did not recognize, hired guns brought in from outside the territory, men who had no connection to Bitter Creek and would feel no hesitation about spilling blood on its soil. The sight of Winona standing beside Elijah, her chin raised defiantly, seemed to take them by surprise. Crawford reined in his horse and stared at her for a long moment, his expression shifting from confusion to calculation to something that looked almost like amusement. "Well now," he said, his voice carrying easily across the cold morning air. "Looks like the savage decided to show herself after all. Makes our job easier." "She's not a savage," Elijah replied, his voice hard as iron. "She's my wife." The words landed like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples of shock across the assembled men. Greenwood's face went red, then white, his carefully constructed plans visibly crumbling before his eyes. "Your wife?" he sputtered. "That's impossible. You can't just marry a Crawford," cut him off with a raised hand, his eyes narrowing as he assessed this unexpected development. "When did this marriage supposedly take place?" "Last night," Elijah said. "Performed by Jacob Whitfield, witnessed by his wife and their eldest son. Legal, documented, and binding under territorial law. My wife is now a resident of my property with my full consent and protection. Any attempt to remove her against her will is kidnapping, not law enforcement." The marshal's jaw tightened, and Elijah could see him working through the legal implications, searching for loopholes that might still allow him to achieve his objectives. "A marriage performed under duress," he said finally. "Could be argued that you coerced the woman to protect yourself from prosecution. Would hardly be the first time a white man forced himself on an Indian woman." The accusation was vile, and Elijah felt his hand move toward his revolver before Winona's voice cut through the tension. "I was not forced," she said, stepping forward with a courage that made Elijah's heart swell with pride and fear in equal measure. "I chose this man freely, as is my right under the laws of my people and under the laws of yours. I am Winona Cole now, wife of Elijah Cole, and I will not be taken from my home by men who hide their greed behind false authority." Her words echoed across the frozen yard, carrying a power that seemed to transcend language itself. Some of the hired men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, perhaps confronting for the first time the humanity of the woman they had been paid to abduct. But Crawford's expression only hardened further, his investment in this outcome too deep to be swayed by appeals to conscience or law. "Pretty speech," he said coldly, "but it doesn't change the fundamental situation. Greenwood here has claims on this land that predate your husband's deed. Once we sort out the property dispute, your little marriage won't matter much. Hard to be a rancher's wife when there's no ranch left to speak of." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, and Elijah understood suddenly that this had never really been about Winona at all. She was just the excuse, the lever Greenwood needed to pry him loose from land that had been coveted for years. The hatred he saw in Greenwood's eyes was not for the Lakota woman, but for the man who had repeatedly refused to sell, who had stood in the way of expansion and profit and ambition for too long. "This ends today," Greenwood said, his voice dripping with venom, "one way or another." The standoff stretched across frozen seconds that felt like hours. 12 armed men faced a weathered rancher and his Lakota bride, the odds so lopsided that any rational calculation said this could only end one way. Elijah's hand rested on his revolver, his mind running through scenarios that all ended with him dead and Winona at the mercy of men who had none. He thought about telling her to run, to use the escape route through the root cellar while he bought her whatever time his old bones could manage. But one look at her face told him she would never leave him, that she had made her choice and would stand by it even unto death. The realization filled him with equal parts love and despair. Then, from the ridge to the east, came the sound of more horses approaching. Everyone's attention shifted, hands reaching for weapons, eyes straining to identify this new variable in an already volatile equation. What emerged from the tree line made Elijah's breath catch in his throat. Jacob Whitfield led a group of riders, not many, perhaps 8 or 9, but among them were faces that represented the conscience of Bitter Creek. Dr. Samuel Henderson, who had delivered half the babies in the county. Margaret O'Brien, the widow who ran the boarding house and commanded respect through sheer force of personality. Thomas Clearwater, the blacksmith whose massive arms had built half the town, and others, men and women who had watched the growing tyranny of Greenwood and Crawford with increasing unease and had finally decided that enough was enough. "What's the meaning of this, Whitfield?" Crawford demanded, his confident sneer faltering for the first time. Jacob rode forward until he was positioned between the two groups, his chaplain's bearing lending him an authority that transcended mere numbers. "The meaning," he said calmly, "is that you're about to make a very serious mistake. Elijah Cole is a respected member of this community. His marriage to this woman is legal and proper, and the claims Thomas Greenwood has been making about this land are based on documents that several of us have examined and found to be highly questionable." The accusation hung in the air like thunder before lightning. Greenwood's face contorted with rage. "You're calling me a liar?" "I'm calling you a man whose ambition has outpaced his integrity," Jacob replied evenly. "Your father and Elijah's father settled their boundary disputes 30 years ago. The original survey documents are on file at the Territorial Registry, and they contradict everything you've been claiming. We sent a rider to confirm this 2 days ago when we first heard about your plans." The revelation struck the assembled men like a physical blow. Several of the hired guns exchanged uncertain glances, clearly reassessing their involvement in what they had been told was a straightforward legal matter. Crawford's hand moved toward his revolver, but Dr. Henderson's voice stopped him cold. "I wouldn't do that, Marshal. Word of this little expedition reached the territorial governor yesterday. There are federal marshals on their way from Cheyenne even as we speak. Any violence here today will be thoroughly investigated, and I suspect your credentials won't survive the scrutiny." The transformation in Crawford's demeanor was remarkable to witness. The predatory confidence drained from his face, replaced by the calculating desperation of a cornered animal. He looked at Greenwood, seeking guidance, but the rancher seemed equally stunned by this reversal of fortune. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Greenwood made a decision that would seal his fate. "If I can't have this land," he snarled, "no one will." His hand came up holding a torch that one of his men had been carrying, and he flung it toward the cabin with all his strength. The world seemed to slow as the burning brand arced through the cold air, trailing sparks like a comet's tail. Winona moved faster than anyone could have anticipated. She launched herself from the porch, intercepting the torch before it could reach the dry wooden walls, catching it with her bare hands and hurling it aside into the snow where it sputtered and died. Her palms were burned, blistered, but she stood between the cabin and the men who would destroy it with the fierce determination of a warrior defending sacred ground. "You will not take our home," she said, her voice carrying across the yard with a power that seemed to transcend her small frame. "You will not take anything more from me." The hired guns had seen enough. One by one, they began to back their horses away, unwilling to be part of whatever was about to happen. Crawford looked around at his dissolving support and made a decision of his own, spurring his horse toward the road that led away from Bitter Creek and the consequences that were surely coming. Greenwood was left alone, his face purple with thwarted rage, his hand moving toward the pistol at his hip. Elijah saw the motion and responded with reflexes honed by years of combat, his revolver clearing leather and firing in one smooth motion. The shot took Greenwood in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle into the trampled snow. The rancher lay there, clutching his wound and screaming curses that echoed off the silent hills. "It's over, Thomas," Jacob Whitfield said, dismounting and moving to secure the wounded man. "Whatever you paid Crawford, whatever documents you forged, it's all going to come out now. You should have been satisfied with what you had, instead of trying to steal what belonged to others." Elijah crossed the yard to where Winona stood, her burned hands cradled against her chest, her eyes bright with tears she was too proud to shed. He took her hands gently in his own, examining the angry red blisters that marked her palms. "You could have let it burn," he said softly. "We could have rebuilt." She looked up at him, this woman who had lost one home to flames and had nearly sacrificed herself to save another. "This is our home," she replied. "The first real home I have had since the soldiers came. I could not let him take it from us." He pulled her close, mindful of her injured hands, feeling her heart beat against his chest. Behind them, their neighbors were tending to the aftermath, binding Greenwood's wound and preparing to transport him to town for judgment. The hired guns had scattered to the winds, wanting no part of the legal reckoning that was sure to follow. And somewhere on the road to Cheyenne, Marshal Crawford was riding hard away from a past that would eventually catch up with him. The battle was won. The future stretched before them, uncertain but bright with possibility. The weeks that followed the confrontation brought changes that rippled through Bitter Creek like stones dropped into still water. Thomas Greenwood was arrested and transported to Cheyenne to face charges of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted arson, his carefully constructed empire of lies crumbling around him as investigators uncovered the full extent of his deceptions. The forged documents he had used to claim Elijah's land were traced to a corrupt surveyor in Denver who had been selling false deeds for years, and the scandal eventually reached all the way to the territorial governor's office. Marshal Crawford was apprehended 3 weeks later in Montana, trying to cross into Canada, and was returned in chains to answer for his abuse of authority. The men who had ridden with them scattered like autumn leaves before a winter wind, wanting nothing more than distance between themselves and the consequences of their employers' ambitions. For Elijah and Winona, the aftermath was quieter, but no less transformative. Dr. Henderson came to the ranch the morning after the confrontation to treat Winona's burned hands, applying salves and bandages with the gentle competence of a man who had tended countless wounds over his long career. The burns were serious, but would heal without permanent damage, he assured them, as long as she rested and allowed her body to recover. But rest did not come easily to Winona. Even with her hands wrapped in white cotton, she insisted on contributing to the daily work of the ranch, finding ways to be useful that did not require the full use of her fingers. She supervised the feeding of the animals, offering advice on their care drawn from her people's generations of living close to the land. She taught Elijah how to read the weather and the patterns of bird flight and the behavior of the horses. She filled the cabin with her presence in ways that made him wonder how he had ever survived the long years of solitude before her arrival. The people of Bitter Creek came to accept her gradually, then with increasing warmth. Martha Whitfield visited regularly, bringing food and company and the kind of practical wisdom that only another woman could provide. Margaret O'Brien invited Winona to help with the quilting circle that met weekly at the boarding house. And though some of the women were initially uncertain, Winona's skill with needlework and her quiet dignity soon won them over. Even the children of the town, who had initially regarded her with the fearful curiosity that their parents' prejudices had instilled, began to seek her out for the stories she told about the animals and spirits of her people's traditions. She became known as Mrs. Cole, the rancher's wife, and if some still whispered about the unusual circumstances of her marriage, those whispers grew quieter with each passing week. Spring came early that year, the snows melting to reveal a land hungry for renewal. Elijah and Winona worked together to prepare the fields for planting, their partnership extending naturally from the domestic sphere to the demanding labor of ranch life. He marveled at her strength, at the way she could work alongside him from dawn to dusk without complaint, at the knowledge she brought from her own people's agricultural traditions that complemented and enhanced his own methods. Together they expanded the kitchen garden that Margaret had once tended, adding corn and squash and beans in the ancient pattern that Winona's mother had taught her, the three sisters that had sustained her people for generations beyond counting. In the evenings, they sat together by the fire and talked about the future in ways that neither had dared to imagine during the dark days of winter. Winona spoke of her desire to create a space where the traditions of her people could be preserved and shared, where the children of the territory might learn the stories and skills that were being systematically erased by government policies and missionary schools. Elijah spoke of expanding the ranch, of building something that could be passed down to future generations, of creating a legacy that would outlast his own brief time upon the earth. Their dreams intertwined like the roots of trees growing side by side, drawing strength from shared soil while reaching toward their own portions of the sky. It was on a warm evening in April that Winona first told him she was carrying his child. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the hills that had witnessed so much struggle and transformation, when she took his weathered hand and placed it gently on her belly. The gesture needed no explanation. Elijah felt tears spring to eyes that had wept so rarely over the long years of his life, tears of joy and wonder, and a gratitude so profound it defied expression. A child, their child, a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for generations, a living testament to the love that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings. "You're certain?" he managed to ask, his voice rough with emotion. Winona smiled, the same radiant smile that had transformed her face on the night she first agreed to be his wife. "The spirits of my ancestors have shown me," she replied. "A son, strong and healthy, who will carry the blood of both our peoples. He will know the stories of his Lakota grandmother and the courage of his soldier grandfather. He will belong to this land in ways that neither of us alone could claim." Elijah pulled her close, this woman who had become the center of his world, and felt the future opening before them like a flower turning toward the sun. The road ahead would not be easy. Their son would face challenges that neither of them could fully anticipate, caught between two cultures in a territory that was still learning to see native peoples as human beings deserving of respect and dignity. But he would face those challenges with parents who loved him, with a community that was slowly learning to embrace difference rather than fear it, with a legacy of survival and resilience that ran through both lines of his ancestry. As darkness fell over the prairie and the stars emerged one by one in the vast Wyoming sky, Elijah Cole held his wife and thought about the strange paths that life could take. He had opened his door on a cold October evening, expecting nothing more than to offer temporary shelter to a stranger in need. Instead, he had found love, purpose, and a future he had long since stopped believing was possible. The cabin that had once felt like a prison of solitude now felt like a sanctuary of hope. And somewhere beneath his palm, a new life was growing, carrying within it the promise of generations yet to come. The baby came in the golden days of late September, when the prairie grass had turned to amber and the cottonwoods along the creek blazed with autumn fire. Elijah had spent the summer building a nursery onto the cabin, working with his own hands to craft a cradle from timber he had cut and cured himself, sanding the wood until it was smooth as silk beneath his calloused palms. Winona had watched him work with quiet approval, her belly growing round with the life they had created, her hands busy with the beadwork and soft leather garments that would welcome their son into the world. When her time came, Martha Whitfield served as midwife, her steady hands and calm voice guiding Winona through the long hours of labor, while Elijah paced the porch like a caged animal, his prayers rising toward a sky that had never seemed so vast or so indifferent. The cry that finally pierced the autumn evening was the most beautiful sound Elijah had ever heard. He burst through the door to find Winona exhausted but radiant, cradling a small bundle wrapped in the softest deerskin she had prepared during the months of waiting. Martha stepped aside with a knowing smile as Elijah approached the bed, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Winona looked up at him with eyes that held galaxies of love and wonder. "Come meet your son," she said softly. "He has your eyes." Elijah looked down at the tiny face, at the delicate features that somehow combined the best of both their peoples, at the gray eyes that blinked up at him with unfocused curiosity. In that moment, every hardship he had endured, every loss he had suffered, every year of loneliness and regret seemed to fade into insignificance. This child, this miracle of new life, was worth all of it and more. They named him Samuel Thomas Cole, honoring both Elijah's father and the friend who had performed their marriage ceremony and stood with them against those who would have torn them apart. But Winona also gave him a Lakota name, Ohingyang Wichasa, which meant victorious man, a name that carried within it all her hopes for the child who would walk between two worlds. The people of Bitter Creek came to pay their respects in the days that followed, bringing gifts of food and clothing and their kind of practical support that frontier communities offered to their own. Even those who had once looked askance at the unusual marriage seemed moved by the sight of the gray-eyed baby, this living bridge between cultures that had spent generations in conflict. The years that followed were not without their challenges. The territory continued to struggle with the legacy of violence and displacement that had defined relations between settlers and native peoples for generations. There were those who never fully accepted Winona or her son, who muttered darkly about mixed blood and the degradation of civilized society. But these voices grew quieter with each passing season, overwhelmed by the evidence of a family that worked hard, contributed to the community, and asked nothing more than the chance to live in peace. Samuel grew strong and curious, learning to ride almost before he could walk, absorbing the stories and skills of both his heritages with the voracious appetite of a child who sensed that he was something new in the world. Elijah often sat on the porch in the evenings, watching his wife teach their son the patterns of beadwork that had been passed down through generations of Lakota women, listening to the mingled sounds of English and Lakota that filled their home with music. He thought sometimes about the man he had been before Winona came into his life, the bitter soldier slowly drinking himself toward a lonely grave, and marveled at the transformation that love had wrought. He had opened his door expecting to offer temporary charity and had instead received a gift beyond measure. The ranch prospered under their shared stewardship. The herd grew larger each year, and the crops Winona had introduced flourished in soil that seemed to respond to her touch. They hired hands to help with the expanding operation, young men from both cultures who learned that working together accomplished more than suspicion and division ever could. When Samuel was 5 years old, Winona gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret Rose, after Elijah's first wife and the flower that grew wild on the prairie each spring. The girl had her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn chin, and she wrapped Elijah around her tiny finger from the moment she first smiled up at him. Their family was complete now, a small constellation of love and hope burning bright against the vast darkness of a world still learning that different did not mean lesser, that bridges could be built where walls had once seemed inevitable. The cabin that had once held nothing but silence and regret now rang with laughter and music and the endless questions of children discovering the wonders of existence. On the evening of their 10th anniversary, Elijah and Winona stood together on the porch, watching the sun set over the land they had fought to keep and had made their own through years of labor and love. Samuel was helping his sister learn to throw a rope, their voices carrying on the warm autumn air. The prairie stretched golden and endless toward mountains that held the last light of day like a blessing. "I never thanked you properly," Elijah said quietly, "for saving my life." Winona looked up at him with eyes that still held the power to take his breath away. "You saved mine first," she replied. "We saved each other. That is how it should be between husband and wife." He pulled her close, this woman who had transformed his existence from mere survival into something rich and meaningful and full of possibility. Behind them, their children laughed and played on land that would one day be theirs, inheritors of a legacy forged from unlikely love and stubborn hope. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the voices of ancestors from both their peoples, blessing the union that had brought forth new life from old sorrow. And as darkness gathered and the stars emerged to watch over the sleeping prairie, Elijah Cole knew that he had found, in the autumn of his years, the home he had been searching for all along.